Starting our list off at number 10, crucifixion. Most of the time when it came to crucifixion, the accused would be tied to their crosses, right? They weren't always nailed to it, and there's a bizarre reason why that was done. It was a Roman practice for some to be nailed, that's true of course, but it's next to impossible to find any remains from these ancient punishments because the nails of the crucified victims were looked at as powerful charms or an amulet almost. I don't know. Again, this was the ancient world, so they loved harming others, but then they also believed in good luck and good karma at the same time. So you're like, okay, sure. Some believe that they had healing properties, which is ironic considering what act they just performed with said nail. Know what I mean? It's like, hey, where'd you get that one from? That guy's arm, actually. Yeah, it's nice. In 1968, a team of builders were laying foundation for a new suburb in northern Jerusalem. Now, while digging, they found the remains of a foot with a nail still in it, still in the bone. Jehohanan was the first victim of crucifixion ever found in Israel. This was an important find. Now, the reason the nail was left in, well, experts guess, is because the nail was bent at the tip and nobody could get it out, which is horrible. Imagine seeing that scene. Ugh. Number 9, damnatio ad bestias. Also known as killing by wild animals, this was a form of Roman capital punishment in which the accused was, well, you guessed, killed by wild animals in an arena. Now you may be thinking about Gladiator at this point. This was a little different. This was about 80 years before that. The gladiators, they could defend themselves to some degree, but those meeting their fate with this method, they were defenseless. They were tied to one spot or they were given a small weapon made of wood. It was an insult, really. This form of punishment was seen in ancient Rome starting around the 2nd century BC. 80 years later, the Colosseum saw a similar practice, only then it was, UFC. It was this big Colosseum, it was a public viewing, and they could fight back with tridents or nets, which I guess helps. I don't know, not really. Number 8, boat. Death by boat. What does that even mean? I don't even want to know what this is. Here we go. First described by Plutarch as a Persian torture technique, the accused, in this case, in the boat case, was stripped completely naked and then tied to 2 different boats. Now at this point, I'd already be unconscious. This is terrifying. The guilty was forced to drink milk and honey in large quantities until they were extremely ill. Now at this point, they would be bad enough to be on a boat in the hot sun, sick to your stomach, naked, but no. They just had to get a little more creative, right? At this point, honey was then spread on your actual body, and then you were sent out in the middle of the water. Exposed to intense heat, insects that drank your blood, you would die of dehydration, hunger, or septic shock. All terrible ways to go individually, let alone all that happening to you at the same time while strapped to a boat. Let's move on before I'm sick. Number 7, peeling. This is the shortest one on our list here today, and well, that's because there's not quite much to say about it. Peeling, just kind of like how you peel an orange, but instead, a person. Yeah, brutal, right? Hit that thumbs up for brutality. You wanted this, that's why you clicked it. Used by the Assyrians and then later by the Romans, those fancy Romans. The victim in this case was covered in hot water. Already a bad start. And then some monster would then take a blade, start out of your feet, and then slowly and surely just take little bits of you away. Now death of course depended on how much skin was removed and how extensive the wounds were, so it wasn't the same every time. Sometimes it was fast and other times it was really, really slow, which is horrible. Either way, come on, what is this, Game of Thrones? How do you do this to a person? Number 6, the bronze bull. Romans used this type of punishment and Saint Eustache was baked apparently in a bronze bull with his wife, all under the command of Emperor Hadrian. Now, however, the Catholic Church considers these stories to be completely untrue. So that little breath that you just did, it's okay, you can release that now. The odds that this one actually happened are quite slim. But then again, after that boat thing, who knows? It's worth mentioning, it probably happened once or twice. Because a very similar fate happened to Antipas of Pergamon during the persecution of Domitian in 92 AD. The bull was also used in 287 AD during Emperor Diocletian at the Pelagia of Tarsus. Now, did they bake anybody? Let's hope not, but they found one there, so I don't know. There's a lot of room on the inside, if you know what I'm saying. Number 5, the breaking wheel. Origins in Greece, but Rome still fancied a wheel or two, apparently. This method is a little much. Again, after what I've just said, you're like, really? This is weirdly the worst for me. I don't know. A naked victim, naked right off the bat, always naked. Why is everyone always naked? Can we just have a guy with jeans on for one show? The victim with widely spaced limbs was tied to a metal ring, a wheel, some would say, sure. Then the executioner, this big guy who you don't want to meet, he would come in and crush your body with a club, which, the edges were covered with metal. A big hammer, really, that's what you can call it. Now, after crushing the limbs, the victim was placed in an upright position, okay, and then at that point, folks would watch. No one was working back then. Folks would just hang out and watch all day as birds would consume what is left. Yeah, again, welcome to the ancient times. I'm gonna go throw up now. Number 4, keel hauling. As somebody who is not a fan of water at all, this was a type of punishment that I can't even imagine. No, it sounds like something from Game of Thrones. It can vary depending on how bad the ocean is. Imagine that as a lead up. The ocean's bad, so should be pretty bad today. You're like, oh no, what's gonna happen? This punishment was reserved, of course, as you guessed, for sailors. Sailors at sea, a couple of naughty mateys. Now, it was first performed by the Dutch Navy in the late 16th century, but again, origins go all the way back to Rome, because, you know, they're the OG, the OG beaters, I guess. And what would happen was the accused were tied with rope and then dragged underwater from one end of the ship to the other. While many died or drowned, obviously, being flossed around a pirate ship covered in barnacles, it wasn't always fatal, which makes this worse somehow. I don't know, I don't want to live after that. Not always, but a good amount of time, it was probably the end of your line. Number 3, strappato. Strappato sounds like an Italian artist, but it's definitely not. Don't try and look this one up on Google. You won't like it. It's creative, I'll admit, but all in the worst ways. It's an uncomfortable form of punishment. Unlike others on this list, it doesn't end in death, purposely. In strappato, the guilty is strung up by the wrists behind the head. Now at first, it doesn't sound that bad, but of course it gets a little worse. The awkward angle at this point is pretty much guaranteed to cause dislocation of the shoulders, but if it doesn't do anything that's too bad, weights would be added. So then something would break, something would be out of place, and then you'd be broken for the rest of your life, which in my opinion is way worse than a death, a fast death. I'd rather that for sure. Number 2, sawing. Sawing, yeah, like in The Terrifier. You ever seen that movie? It's kind of like that. Mostly seen in Rome, Spain, and some portions of Asia. Yeah, popular one this one was. It was pretty straightforward. You can imagine this one, what it would entail. Capital punishment at its cruelest, getting sawed in half. Again, to the public. Yeah, that's a fact that we don't really like to put in there. All these are public. People like to come out and watch this happen. Disgusting. Another fact that some folk don't realize, this one sent shivers down my spine, but sometimes the sawing was done from top to bottom, not side to side. It's almost impressive, right? It's like cutting a carrot vertically. It's like rolling around. You're like, huh, it's a little awkward, but we got it done. Yeah, except a person with bones and a soul. And finally, number 1, the wooden horse. Yeehaw, we'll end on this one. This is pretty bad. Also, hit that thumbs up and hit subscribe. You've made it this far, you're gonna love what we have on our channel, because honestly, what are you doing here? This is some pretty dark content. This device was used all through history, and different variations of it existed at different times throughout different parts of the world, because the general concept was the same. It was a punishment meant to inflict a great deal of pain to the, you know, down areas. The device was a wooden block, sort of, normally in the shape of a triangle with a point at the top, a very sharp, very sanded point right at the top there. That's where you'd have to sit. Right there in that little triangle of death. Whoever was having the pain inflicted upon them would be tied up and then placed onto this block with a leg on either side, almost like a horse. From there, they would have weights tied to their legs in order to slowly lower them further and further onto this already very uncomfortable block. In later years, post-Roman times, the punishment would be inflicted at the same time as the person was being paraded throughout town. Again, another public event. I can't even watch UFC. I can't watch a guy perform an armbar, let alone watch this. Are you kidding me? No, I'm gonna throw up.
Coming in at number 10, this list of maniacal rulers seems almost endless, but let's start off with King Leopold II of Belgium. Leopold reigned from 1865 to 1909, and he was certainly a busy boy. This was at the height of colonialism, so you can only imagine how bad things get from there. Leopold was in charge of what was called the Congo Free State, and made it his own private property to do with as he wished. And that he did. It was entirely different from the typical colonial style, as Leopold established a brutal dictatorship on the land. He disguised his intentions by creating a philanthropic society called the International African Society. This gave him the government support he needed to hire mercenaries whose job it was to get as much money out of the territory as possible, by whatever means necessary. Ugh! Hate him. By introducing a system of forced free labor in order to extract the riches of the land, Leopold was responsible for causing the deaths of 20% of the population. In 1904, however, Roger Casement released a report unveiling the horrors of what Leopold had done, which led Leopold to surrender the Congo, though it remained part of Belgium into the 1950s. Ugh, like I said, starting off strong, am I right? Coming in at number 9. Now let's talk about good old King John, shall we? Not a nice guy. I must say. Surely when I said King John, you immediately thought of Robin Hood or Richard the Lionheart, or both. One is correct, Robin Hood actually wasn't associated with King John, but Lionheart was his brother. You may not have liked him in any movie adaptations, but man, he wasn't that bad. He was worse. Granted, medieval England wasn't a great place to live in the first place because everybody was stinky, there was bad health, you almost could die like walking down the street for no reason. But John's cruelty was almost unheard of. He killed his nephew, or made him disappear, but would more regularly enjoy starving his enemies to death. And did exactly that to the wife and son of his former friend William de Brieux. Unlike his brother, John was also incredibly cowardly and repeatedly showed his back to the enemy battle after battle. He also tried to seize the throne from his brother Richard the Lionheart while he was in captivity, which we know is part of the Robin Hood story, and so were the incredibly high taxes he made his people pay. The extortion, cruelty, and lechery that King John left in his wake makes him a perfect addition to our top 10 list. Coming in at number 8, we have Nero. I know he's technically not a king, but he's an emperor, and he was too nuts not to mention, so here we are. From burning Christians at night so they could light his garden, to kicking his second wife to death, the list goes on and on. He also killed his mother and brother in order to secure his throne, but what you may not have known was how he did some of his killings. A common form of punishment was having the criminal tied to a post and torn apart by animals. What Nero reportedly did to a woman named Locusta, a woman his mother hired to kill his father and brother, will haunt your dreams. He had her assaulted by a specially trained giraffe before she was fed to the animals. Yeah, that's right, you heard me. A giraffe. Yeah. Nero was reportedly obsessed with this form of killing and even implemented it into his He would often dress up as a beast and have his array of lovers, male and female, tied to posts and pretend to bite them. I mean, that's technically not evil, like, to each their own, I guess, but as you heard before, there are plenty of other things he did to make it onto this list. Nero was an arrogant and narcissistic ruler. He even had his own crowd of people who followed him and cheered him on. Coming in at number 7, hey, I had to bring this guy up. We all know him. You've seen the movies, you've seen the TV shows, you've listened to the Broadway hit 6? At least I hope you have. That's right, we couldn't get through this list without talking a little bit about our good old friend, Henry VIII. And you can guess what we're gonna mention. If you can, you're ahead of the game. I'll lock myself out. Henry beheaded 2 of his wives and divorced 3, and 1 beat him to the punch and died in childbirth. Like most kings, Henry was desperate for a male heir, but his first wife, Catherine, could only give him a daughter, so he started wandering around. Unluckily for Henry, his one mistress did give birth successfully to a son, though he was illegitimate, so it didn't count. One of his most famous mistresses turned wife was Anne Boleyn, an ambitious courtier who promised Henry that she could give him a son. Well, they don't know what we know now, so, you know, who could blame her? So desperate to wed her, Henry reformed the church so he could divorce Catherine. But when Anne gave birth to a daughter, future Queen Bess, I might add, he was still hopeful she would give birth to a son, but a few stillborns later, he accused her of adultery and treason so he could get rid of her. That's inventive. Good job, man. The next wife he beheaded was Catherine Howard, one who he also accused of adultery and executed. I mean, I get it, sometimes marriages don't go the way you plan, but like chopping off their heads? Really? Damn, dude. Coming in at number 6, next up, we have Ferdinand I, King of Naples. Ferdinand took pleasure in the phrase, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. Man, this guy is nuts. The key word here being pleasure. Apparently, the court of Naples had a lot of hope for Ferdinand when he took over, showing much promise as a ruler. He was intelligent, courageous, confident, but unfortunately, his rule soon turned malicious. But like our good friend Vlad the Impaler, as we'll talk about later, he liked to invite his enemies over for dinner, then imprison them and throw them out of windows. But once they were deceased, he missed them too much, so he had them embalmed and dressed in clothing they wore while they were alive. Then he placed them on display in what he called his Black Museum, kind of like that episode of Black Mirror, and would sometimes go in there and just, you know, admire them. But if he suspected any of his subjects were going to betray him, he would invite them into his museum so they could see what might happen if they do betray him. He even had some of the bodies propped up like they were eating at one of his fine banquets. Sounds like a great party, Ferdinand. Yeah, love that. Whew, keep going. It's just creepy, man. Coming in in at number 5, next up we have King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, who actually died only in 2015. Abdullah reigned for 5 years and violated so many human rights, that's pretty much all he's remembered for. Anyone who said anything against his rule or the royal family would be tortured and sometimes even put to death. He even sentenced a blogger to 1,000 lashings publicly and 10 years in prison for setting up a website and insulting religious authorities. He also considered anyone who deviated from the religion of the state to be enemies and in most cases literal terrorists. The blogger is just one example of the 1,000 political prisoners who have been arrested and tortured just because they asked a question. King Abdullah died in 2015 and his reign remains a controversial one, as he did also try to negotiate peace in the East, but many will always remember his medieval ways of torture and imprisonment in the modern day. Coming in at number 4 we have Olaf Tryggvason, the King of Norway. If you love shows like the Vikings, then it may interest you to learn the brutal ways of Olaf Tryggvason, the King of Norway. Now we all know a lot of our ancestors weren't the cleanest, or anywhere near the kindest. Brutal murders were commonplace, well, with pillaging and plundering being part of the job. But even people who were used to being covered in blood feared this man. The King of Norway wasn't afraid to slay pagans or anyone else he deemed as a traitor, even killing a slave who assassinated a rival for him. What the heck is that? But the most infamous of all of his murders was also the most brutal. Raud was a determined pagan and dedicated follower of Thor. Olaf forced a live snake down the man's throat and chased it with a red-hot poker, forcing the snake to dig out of Raud's neck, killing him. I can't even say that. I can't even say that. Whew, man, what a way to go. He then viciously dispatched his followers, stole his gold, and kept only those who would be baptized. If you weren't scared of snakes before, have fun getting that image out of your head. And I spoiled this before, oops, didn't mean to, but here we are. Okay, coming in hot at number 3. Before I do, remember if you like this video, give it a little thumbs up. We appreciate it, it's amazing. Coming in at number 3, we have Vlad the Impaler. Of course he's on this list. Did you think I wasn't gonna include him? Okay, the question remains, what didn't this crazy monarch do? I mean, let's be real. This ruler was so cruel that he established a legend about himself that inspired the tales of Dracula. To earn a name like Vlad the Impaler, he must have been really good at one thing: impaling. His father, Dracul, which means dragon in Romanian, and the rest of his family were brutally murdered in a coup, and some historians suspect that this, along with his abusive childhood trapped with the Turks, were the catalyst for a bloody rule. Vlad took the name Dracula, which means son of the dragon, but I think we know that name for another reason, and plotted his revenge. One of the first things he did was hold a banquet for all of his rivals in the guise of making peace. What they didn't know was that he would be the only one dining. His guests were soon stabbed to death, and those who remained alive were impaled on stakes, all while he sat and enjoyed his dinner. Some even say he drank their blood when his wine was empty, so you can see where that legend comes from. Beyond impaling though, he was also one of the first kings to use chemical warfare by sending those infected with deadly diseases to mingle with soldiers on enemy camps. For those of you who love like Twilight and, you know, like Vampire Diaries, man, this paints a very bad pictures of vampires. If they weren't bad already. I don't know. I like them too. I get it. Coming in piping hot at number 2. Okay, this one was almost number 1. I feel like this one and number 1 are kind of tied because they're both brutal. So here we go. We have the one, the only, Genghis Khan, ruler of the Mongolian Empire. This guy killed so many people and is recorded to have killed 1.2 million people in a single battle. Just one of his battles. Reports even say that he killed so many people their bones became mountains and that the soil became oily from the rotting corpses. Genghis Khan was supposedly responsible for over 40 million deaths. If you need a number to compare that to, that's the same amount of people who died in World War I. Also considering the massive amount of he committed, it is estimated that around 16 million people are descendant from him today. Khan had a brutal upbringing which turned him into an even more brutal man, and he killed his half-brother for not sharing food with him at just 10 years old. He was also horrendous when it came to torturing his betrayers. Some ways include pouring molten silver down their throats and sawing people in half. I can't even say that with a straight face. He also held mass beauty contests, and all those who didn't win would be given to his soldiers. Oh. And he killed 75% of the population of Iran, and he tried to commit an entire genocide. Guys, the list goes on. I'm not even done, but I don't have time in this video to talk about everything he did. And also, I feel super disgusting even talking about him, so let's move on, shall we? Okay, we're arriving at the #1 spot. This next guy was so bad, he got named after it. Ivan the Terrible was one of the most horrific rulers in history. This guy is probably what would have happened if Joffrey or Ramsay actually became king. In 1543, when Ivan was just 13, he ordered the capture and arrest of fellow Prince Andrew Shusky and had him fed to ravenous dogs. Does that remind you of GOT? Because it does for me. There were also sure signs that he was a psychopath, as he often delighted in killing small helpless animals for fun. Priests begged him to repent and reform the corrupt ways of the government, and for a while he did. When he was married to his wife Anastasia Romanova, reportedly they were happy for 13 years before Anastasia fell ill and passed along with her son. The king then flew into a depressive wave, and his reign became as treacherous as you could imagine it would be. Ivan formed the Operniki gang, a league of men dressed in black robes who rode black horses and spent their time killing anyone they deemed traitors under God. They even barged into churches and killed priests if they felt they needed to. Ivan was also a sadist and subjected the men and women to horrendous sexual torture within and beyond the walls of the palace. But then, flip a switch and the events would cease following an extended self-induced repentance period. He would repent so hard sometimes he'd punish himself by throwing his head against a wall. Everyone feared him. Ivan married a sum of 8 times, killing some of his wives by drowning and sending others to convents. Even his eldest son, who he loved, was beaten to death by the very hands of his father. Oh my god, this is the same thing as #2, which is honestly why I think they match. It's like a tie for #1. There was so much to say about Ivan the Terrible that he just had to be on this list.
Starting us off at number 10 is burial gifts. As I mentioned already, a huge part of Viking culture was their massive network they had in place to trade slaves. In fact, it's believed that pretty much their entire economy was built off of it. Many were sold off, of course, but a huge number remained under the Norsemen's jurisdiction to be given to the high-ranking citizens. But what happened to them once their masters died? Well, apparently they were sacrificed and given to the dead masters as a burial gift. It was believed that if the slave was sacrificed for the funeral of their master and buried with them, that the slave would follow its master into the afterlife and continue its duties serving them. This practice wasn't confirmed entirely until pretty recently, around the 1980s, after a group of burials were found where obviously high status burials were accompanied beside a clearly low status one. How could they tell which was which? Well, charmingly, Vikings would decapitate the slaves before placing them beside their masters so as to make it clear who was of a higher social class. Coming in at number 9 is Berserker. Vikings were known for being ruthless killing machines, so much so that the state in which they would enter during their near daily raids got named Berserker, as they went berserk. But it's widely believed that they didn't just go into their wild killing sprees fancy-free and sober, but were actually under the influence to help them achieve their goal of butchering the whole city. One theory published that Vikings entered this berserker state by ingesting psilocybin mushrooms, or magic mushrooms. The theory is that the hallucinogens allowed them to disconnect from reality as well as increase their adrenaline levels, sending them into their so-called berserker state. This isn't to say that magic mushrooms are going to send anyone who ingests them into a massive killing spree at all, but since that was the Vikings' intention going into it, these mushrooms simply allowed them to perhaps hallucinate a slightly different reality, making the job of raiding and stealing people a little bit less taxing. But again, it's just a theory at this point. Coming in at number 8 is house bears. So this one actually makes a lot of sense if you think about it. I mean, really, it is hard to imagine a vicious Viking coming home to cuddle with a little cat or dog. But how did they manage to get their hands on bears in the first place? Well, on days where there weren't cities to invade or slaves to torture, they would raid bear dens and steal the cubs away from their mothers before bringing them home to raise as their own. I mean, truly only a Viking could find a way to get a cub away from its mother without being disemboweled. disemboweled. There were some limits to these wild pets, however, as even for the Vikings this was seen as pretty out there. Often the non-Viking members of the community objected to this as they feared the bears would attack their families, eat their livestock, or ruin their crops. If the bear ever proved to be out of hand, the Viking in charge of it would be issued a pretty hefty fine. Eventually, too many bears were, well, honestly just being normal bears, and things got so out of hand that the practice became outlawed. If only they had had similar sympathy for all the people they killed. Coming in at number 7 are swimming games. It wasn't all raiding, pillaging, and slave trading when it came to Vikings. Even they too needed a break from that sometimes. Well, sort of. In their free time, Vikings would often play games in the water, which they referred to as swimming. Now let me be clear. Game is a very loose term here. I am sure they were having a blast, but quite literally no one else on the planet would want to do this for fun. You see, what Vikings called swimming, most would describe as, let's see which Viking can drown the other Viking first. The rules were simple. Hold your opponent under the water for as long as possible. First one to kill the other wins. Now, these games weren't mandatory. The men were more than welcome to stop playing whenever they wanted, so the general sentiment was that it sucks to suck if you get killed, that's your own fault. Sounds like a nice breezy way to spend your afternoon, don't you think? Coming in at number 6 is Viking soup. As you can imagine, injury was a very common occurrence among the Norse communities. They were just about always in battle, and even when they were off duty, their games involved a fight to the death. This means that the wives, mothers, sisters, and daughters of all the Viking warriors became quite knowledgeable about medicine and wounds over time. Specifically, Viking women developed a very unique way to gauge just how bad a stab or a slash wound was. The ladies would make a super strong onion soup that they would feed to the injured warriors. Then after the men ate the soup, the women would smell the wounded area. If they were able to smell the broth through the gash, they knew it was too deep. He would be marked as a lost cause and they would do nothing to save him. Only the men with no smell coming through their wounds received remedies. So what do you say? Should we bring this one back or? Next up at number 5 is holmgang. Viking law was, let's just say, a little bit all over the place. The systems they had in place would not hold up in a court of law today. For example, a lower class individual could under absolutely no circumstances insult anyone of a higher class. But killing your neighbor, well, that wasn't necessarily off limits. This practice was referred to as holmgang, and it was pretty much the Viking version of a duel. A man who felt wronged by another could challenge him to a fight. The fight had to take place within a week, and someone could take the challengee's place as long as it was decided prior to the fight. Rules of the fight itself varied from region to region, but usually included how many weapons were allowed, who struck first, what signified the winner, and the compensation for the victor. Often the holmgang would only be finished after one man had died. And if the man who was challenged didn't show, well, things did not end well for them. They would automatically be declared guilty, and anyone from any social class was legally allowed to kill them. Meaning, under the right circumstances, a slave could kill a noble and be completely within their rights to do so. Coming in at number 4 is the sale of eunuchs. As I mentioned, Vikings were notorious for raiding seaside cities. One of their more frequented hotspots upon their ruthless invasions were monasteries. Not because they held any kind of deep disdain for Christianity. Well, actually, who knows, that could have been part of it too, honestly. But mostly it was because they could guarantee that their kidnappees would be literate men. Let me explain. At the same time that this was happening, there was a high demand for eunuchs from the Middle East to be put to work as teachers, harem guards, government workers, and palace servants. So in came the Norse pirates who would raid the Christian monasteries, kidnap the literate men, castrate them, then sell them off to be put to work in the East. The eunuch part was so important because they were viewed as more trustworthy, having been stripped of their manhood, and literacy was required for the jobs they would be forced into. I mean, it's just truly sick from top to bottom. Coming in at At number 3 is human sacrifice. Vikings widely practiced pagan beliefs, wherein they worshipped multiple different gods. One of these gods was Odin. To make sure that they were still in Odin's good graces, every 9 years, Vikings would assemble and sacrifice 99 people, horses, dogs, and hawks, before they were hanged from the trees of the Holy Grove, which, if that's true, that is like a whopping 396 sacrifices total to be completed once every decade. Now, that number could be exaggerated, for sure, but the actual practice really did happen all the time. Archaeologists have uncovered sacrificial sites on the land once inhabited by the Norsemen, filled with both animal and human bones alike. And contrary to a popular story of the time, it was not a self-sacrifice. During the 10th century, there is a tale of a slave girl who tried to get out of the sacrifice, and instead of being used in a sacrifice for Odin, was dragged to her execution. And before they killed her, she was taken advantage of publicly by 6 different men so as to teach her a lesson of trying to evade the sacrifice to Odin. Coming in at number 2, Unsettling. The Vikings had some really dark practices, but this one might just be one of the saddest. After a new life was welcomed into the world, a christening of sorts called Unsettling would be performed, where they would essentially announce their name and welcome them to the community. But not just anyone received such treatment. Parents would examine the new life first and decide if it was worth keeping, or if they should just leave it to die in the harsh exposure of nature. Unsurprisingly, more often than not, the ones they chose not to raise were almost exclusively female. It's recorded that Viking households were often 4 to 1 with men outnumbering women, which I can only imagine caused problems later in life when new lives were being created. Shockingly, this practice wasn't even viewed as cruel or killing even. They believed as long as the person in question hadn't been through Unsettling, that all was a-okay. And last up in our number 1 spot today is the blood eagle. Vikings are pretty well known for their cruel treatment of, well, whoever they wanted dead. But the absolute worst thing that could happen to you was the blood eagle. Now warning, this one is incredibly disgusting, so don't say I didn't warn you. The blood eagle was a torturous execution that basically involved carving up someone's body to resemble, well, an eagle. Essentially what they would do was splay open your rib cage so that they looked like wings, and to be clear, they did this to you while you were still alive and with obviously no pain meds. After turning you into a human bird, because apparently that wasn't enough torture, they would then pour a salt solution into the open wound before pulling out your lungs and arranging them over the wings so they could watch them flutter like birds until you died. I actually can't even with this one. Like, I don't know what you needed to do to receive such a brutal torture, but my god, it's just one of the most horrific things I've ever read about. Thank God that does not happen anymore.
Coming into number 10, we have the 2018 Salisbury poisoning cover-up. This is a very sensitive topic indeed, and even caused the Russian and British governments to come to blows in a war of words. What happened was that a former Russian military officer and double agent for the UK intelligence service was poisoned in Salisbury. He and his daughter received a nasty dose. Now, Sergei and Yulia Skripal were targeted and spent 3 weeks in hospital. Luckily, they didn't die. Public Health England issued advice for people who visited the Mill Pub and Zizi restaurant, where Mr. Skripal and his daughter ate and drank before falling ill. They told people who had been there to wash their clothes and belongings and seal off anything that cannot be manually cleaned. Some weeks later, a woman died after accidentally handling the nerve agent Novichok discarded by the assassins. Now, one of the Russian chemical weapons scientists has said that hundreds of people in Salisbury could be at risk for years following the attack. British Prime Minister Theresa May said that it was highly likely that the Russian government was responsible, but of course this is Russia. We may find out more information over the next few decades, or we may simply never know. Coming into number 9, we have the Ostankino Tower. The days of Russian radiation poisoning are not said to be over. In the city of Moscow, population 12 million, the Ostankino Tower looms. The tower gives out television and radio signals to the city, however it has been accused of being a mutant maker area because of the electromagnetic radiation it gives out. While this is a bit of an urban legend, with people saying that huge rats exist in the metro stations because of it, there is a scary truth to it. The Kremlin would never admit it, but a 2005 study showed that people in the Ostankino neighborhood were affected by the tower. In other countries, it's reported that scientists are constantly monitoring radiation given out by broadcast towers, but Russia doesn't appear to be. Coming into number 8, we have the 2016 presidential election interference. There is now evidence to suggest what was long since suspected. Russian intelligence hacked the 2016 United States presidential election. The CIA concluded that Russia acted to help Trump and the Republicans win by releasing thousands of stolen emails, many of which were damaging to the Democratic Party. There is also evidence to suggest that the Russian government were bankrolling troll farms. These are places that generate and spread fake news. Current bipartisan investigations are taking place, but Donald Trump has on many occasions denied any involvement. That being said, following his most recent meeting with Vladimir Putin, Trump seemed to actually admit that maybe they were involved. While words from the United States president have been confusing, Russia, of course, are keeping a stony silence. Coming into number 7, we had state-sponsored doping and FIFA. In 2016, it was revealed that Russia was involved with state-sponsored doping of their Olympic team, and that they had been threatening members of the World Anti-Doping Agency. As a result of investigations, it's suspected that between 2011 and 2015, more than 1,000 Russian Olympians benefited from a doping cover-up. Scarily, the investigations also revealed that a lot of the athletes were being given drugs without their knowledge. Anyway, it seems that Russia was back to their old tricks ahead of the FIFA World Cup. There's some evidence to suggest that the Kremlin was bribing FIFA officials ahead of the World Cup to ignore a cheated drugs test. Coming into number 6, we have the Aral smallpox incident. Not only did Russia test nuclear weapons, they were also testing biological weapons. The Aral smallpox incident took place in July 1971, but the world only found out about it 30 years later in 2002. In 1971, the USSR knew that a vaccination for smallpox was widely available and that the disease was on the brink of being eradicated. While that sounds like a great thing, these days it means that most of us haven't actually been vaccinated for smallpox, and if sneaky labs like those that existed in the Soviet era are storing the disease, then they could launch biological warfare. Anyway, the Soviets were testing smallpox as a weapon in an open-air environment. This was all happening on an island port on the Aral Sea. Now, the test got out of control and it caused an outbreak on the island. Hundreds of people were quarantined and 50,000 people were vaccinated as a response. The Kremlin have never acknowledged the incident, but Kazakh officials prepared a report that outlined what happened. They concluded that 3 people died and it could have been a lot worse. Nonetheless, the fact that Russia was testing this in the first place is a scary sign. Coming into number 5, we have Metro 2. According to USA declassified government documents, it seems that the Soviet Union built a secret nuclear layer underneath the public subway. In urban legends, this has been dubbed Metro 2, however it seems as if the bunker is no legend. It's suspected that during the Cold War, Stalin built a whole system of secret trains connecting secret bunkers beneath the city. Now this extends below the Moscow Metro and beyond. It is said Stalin codenamed it D6, a code used by the KGB until 1991 and is still used by the Ministry of Defense to this day. The legend also says that the underground bunker connects the Kremlin, the Federal Security Service headquarters, and the government airport. Some people even say there's an underground town down there primed and prepped for the nuclear apocalypse. In 1994, so nearly 25 years ago, a group of urban explorers claimed to have found the entrance to Metro 2. I for one am wondering who's on the invite list into the bunker if D-Day ever comes. Coming into number 4, we have the Nedelin catastrophe. During the Cold War, both America and Russia were making preparations to attack one another should they have to. What weapons they were creating and how they were developing them was kept a very closely guarded secret until the product was finished. On October the 24th, 1960, the Soviets were testing an intercontinental ballistic missile. Now these are bad news. Either way, early testing didn't go well and the first missile exploded on a launch pad at the Baikonur Sycamore test range. This killed 100 members of staff, including the Chief Marshal of Artillery, Mitrofan Ivanich Nedlin. Despite the huge scale of the disaster, the USSR covered it up. The Soviet government didn't even acknowledge the event until after 1989. Coming into number 3, we have the Lost Cosmonauts. This space race was an interesting time for the world. The USA and the USSR were locked into a battle to be the first to discover the secrets of the wider universe. As a result, Russia poured money into funding space research, but things didn't always go smoothly. Because of the competition with the Americans, the Soviets would cover up if anything went wrong, so any disasters or mistakes were totally covered up in order to present a better image of their efforts to the world. There is a conspiracy theory out there that says that Russia sent several astronauts to space before Yuri Gagarin, but their existence has never been acknowledged by the Soviet or Russian authorities. In 1959, a Czech communist leaked information about now-dead astronauts being sent into space and killed. It also alleged that the USSR had several moonshots that ended in launchpad disasters, including deaths of scientists, technicians, and would-be astronauts. Coming into number 2, we have the Chernobyl disaster. On April the 26th, 1986, a nuclear reactor at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded. This directly killed 31 people. The explosion caused uncontrolled reaction conditions and created an open-air graphite fire that produced updrafts for 9 days. This spewed radioactive fission products into the air. Now, this radioactive material rained down over wider parts of the USSR and Europe. As a result of wider exposure to radioactivity, it is thought that tens of thousands of people were poisoned, but we don't know an exact figure as the Russian Soviet Union did their best to cover up the wider spread of the catastrophe. We don't even know today. Over 30 years later, we still don't have answers. We still don't know the ins and outs of what happened, but it has been pretty much confirmed that the explosion was down to human error and malpractice. Again, we don't know how much of Europe outside of Russia was exposed to radiation poisoning, as the Soviet tried to minimize the drama and actively stunted the scientific research into the incident. By and large, we have all heard of Chernobyl, but that isn't the only Russian radioactive cover-up, not by a long stretch. Coming into number 1, we have the Semipalatinsk tests. Throughout the Soviet era, especially during the Cold War, the USSR tested a lot of nuclear weapons, like a lot. As you may know, the Russians have actually invented the world's most powerful nuclear weapon, the Tsar bomber, that came through exhaustive nuclear tests in facilities across Russian land. One of the most frequently used facilities was Semipalatinsk. This is also known as the Polygon. This land is now in the country of Kazakhstan, but was formerly owned by the USSR. Now, the issue with this test site was that, in reality, it wasn't very remote at all. It was actually just upwind was the town of Semi. Now it seems that the Soviets carried out 456 nuclear tests at this facility between 1949 and 1989, with no regard to the effect on the local people or environment. Russian officials hid the full impact of the radiation exposure for years, but since the facility was closed in 1991, more and more scary details have come to light. This, for example, is a strawberry grown in Semi. Here is a man born in Semi in the height of the testing years. Also, there is so little information about the facility out there that the rest of the world has no idea the full extent of sickness inflicted on humans as a result of the testing. How terrifying.
Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have lobotomies. Did you know that it used to be common practice for people to just get a part of their brain cut out? Okay, well, maybe not common, but it wasn't as uncommon as you would hope. Lobotomies used to be considered an excellent and efficient cure for things such as mental health problems, which thankfully is a practice that has not survived for a very good reason. Of course, in modern medicine they do still exist, but only when actually necessary, and there is of course a lot more knowledge about the dangers and effects. One well-known person to have undergone one of these procedures was Rosemary Kennedy, who was John F. Kennedy's sister. She was experiencing seizures as well as mood swings, and while the seizures certainly were something that needed to be looked after for her health, I'm not sure if the mood swings necessarily needed some kind kind of medical intervention. Anyways, to cure her, they had a lobotomy performed on her. This procedure left her with the mental capacity of a 2-year-old, and she could no longer speak or walk properly. After this, she spent most of the rest of her life hidden away, and it was thought that her family did this because they were ashamed of her, which is both horrible and so sad. In our number 9 spot today, we have the English Civil War. This might be something that is taught more often in English schools, but admittedly it's something I didn't even hear mentioned throughout my time in school. This was actually a series of civil wars that took place between 1642 and 1651, and while it is often referred to as one event, it can be divided into 3 separate wars. These wars were mostly in relation to the manner of England's governance as well as pertaining to religious freedoms. The first war was from 1642 to 1646, and the second was from 1648 to 1649. Both the first and second wars saw supporters of King Charles I battling against supporters of the Long Parliament. The third war took place from 1649 until 1651, and this one saw the supporters of King Charles II fighting against the supporters of the Rump Parliament. In the end, these wars saw the execution of King Charles I, the exile of his son King Charles II, and the replacement of the English monarchy with the Commonwealth of England. There's so much more information about what went on and who was fighting in these wars, but I unfortunately don't have time to cover all of it in the short amount of time we have, but it certainly was a revolutionary period for England, Scotland, and Ireland, and it really was concerned with how these 3 kingdoms should be governed. In our number 8 spot today, we have William the Conqueror. This one is a bit more well known than some of the others on this list today, but I want to specifically talk about one thing in reference to this that is much less well known. In 1807, William the Conqueror decided to take on an all-alcohol diet. This is because he was suffering from extreme obesity and was struggling because of that fact. Because of this, he told his staff that he would only drink wine until his weight went down, but he ended up passing away less than a year later, and most of us are told that this was obviously because of the wine-only diet, but that's not actually true. In an astonishing turn of events, this wine-only diet actually worked. Shortly after beginning his diet, he was able to ride his horse again, which was one of the main reasons he started the diet in the first place, as he was previously too heavy for the horse to carry. He actually died after falling from his horse during an expedition, which was completely unrelated to either his weight or his diet. It's entirely possible that had he not gone on this diet, he would have never ridden his horse and maybe would have lived longer. Truthfully, who knows, but I suppose in a very roundabout way, he did still kind of die from this wine-only diet. In our number 7 spot today, we have the World War II dogs. A lot of us have learned quite a bit about World War II as it affected everyone at the time and was obviously a huge deal. We all have slightly different perspectives on it depending where you grew up and went to school, but it's something that is still widely talked about today. There is so much to cover on this topic, so of course some of it ends up getting left out of the history textbooks, but that doesn't mean the knowledge doesn't survive in some capacity. For today's list, I want to talk about a technique that was used in Russia during World War II that ended up completely backfiring. In Russia, they had trained dogs with bombs strapped onto their backs to run under tanks. I'd like to think that this technique also saw the dog being able to leave the bomb there so that they could escape, but that is most likely wishful thinking, but that isn't even what I wanted to talk about today. While this is, I suppose, a good tactic for fighting a war, there was one grave oversight during this training. All the dogs were of course trained using Russian tanks, since that's where and who they were being trained by, so when it came time for the real deal, these dogs couldn't differentiate between a Russian tank or an enemy tank, which then saw the dogs running under what they knew, which were the Russian tanks. Certainly not the outcome that they were expecting. In our number 6 spot today, we have Mary Shelley. We all know Mary Shelley as the author of Frankenstein, but there's one super creepy and kind of sad thing about her that is much less well known. Mary's husband was a man named Percy, and when he was 29 years old, he was sailing with 2 other men, and on July 8th, 1822, they got caught up in a storm and ended up drowning. The bodies of the men were found 10 days later, and they were only able to be identified based on their clothing. This of course is extremely tragic and sad, and of course it would have been so awful for Mary to have to lose her husband at all, let alone in this way. Percy ended up being cremated, and for some reason his heart was the only part of his body that refused to burn, which I guess now physicians suggest was due to calcification from an earlier bout with tuberculosis. While this in itself is pretty freaky, at first Percy's friend Lee Hunter ended up keeping his heart, but later it was turned over to Mary. Instead of disposing of the heart or doing anything normal with it, Mary ended up keeping the heart, and she carried it with her for years. years. No one knew about this odd little keepsake until a year after her death, when it was found in the drawer of her desk, wrapped up in the pages of one of his last poems. What a simultaneously heartbreakingly beautiful, but also ultra creepy story. The heart ended up being buried in the family vault with Percy and Mary's son after he passed away in 1889. In our number 5 spot today we have strange medicine. It's not necessarily uncommon for us to hear about strange things that people in the past used to do, but sometimes those strange things are also disgusting. It was extremely common in the past for people to use human remains as a form of medicine. You'd think at some point they'd realize that these remains truly were doing more harm than good. Well, I guess we did, but it did go on for much longer than it should have. The cannibalistic treatments would consist of things such as blood, ground up human skull, and even human fat. Tomb raiders would even steal remains in order for them to be sold to the wealthy, which is incredibly dark, and apparently mummy remains were the ideal remains for these sorts of things, which led to a shortage of mummies. I never thought I'd be in a position where I'd be talking about a shortage of mummies, but truly anything can happen over here at Most Amazing Top 10. I guess who am I to judge these past decisions, but all I can say is that I am very glad this is one we have moved on from. In our number 4 spot today we have the Chilean Civil War. Just to throw another war into the mix today, let's talk about the Chilean Civil War of 1891. The short of it on this war is that the president at the time, Jose Manuel Balmaceda, tried to give himself a lot more power than he probably should have had. The Congress weren't exactly thrilled about that, so they and the Chilean Navy rebelled against the president and the army. The Navy made the smart move by going north and seizing the nitrate mines, which were very economically important. From there they sailed south. Like any war, there of course was a lot that went on, but ultimately the Navy and Congress were successful and victorious. This war was actually the first war where modern torpedoes were used and were actually successful, although it took all of the torpedoes they had in just one attack. Part of the reason the Navy was so successful in this war because not only were they able to dominate on land, but also sea. This really led other countries to realize how vital it was for them to have modern ships and naval defenses. It also made other countries realize how important it was for them to have modern weapons. This war may be lesser known and less discussed, but it certainly was an eye-opener for a lot of other countries. In our number 3 spot today we have King Gojien of Yue. King Gojien of Yue had his reign from 496 BC until 465 BC. His reign took place during what was arguably the last major conflict of the spring and autumn period, and he was able to lead his state to victory, but it certainly wasn't an easy road or without some very creepy happenings. The major conflict he led his state through was the war between Wu and Yue, which started when a Yue princess, who was married to a prince of Wu, left her husband and fled back to Yue. I mean, this of course wasn't the only thing that caused the war, but it certainly sparked the fire. King Gojien was an extremely humble king, as he wouldn't relish in the riches he had as most royals would. Instead, he ate the same food as peasants and often would leave himself hungry in order to remember that he was in a position to serve his state. Okay, so you might be sitting there wondering when I'm going to get to the scary historical event that you came to this video for, so here it is. As I mentioned before, he was able to lead his state to victory, but of course a war involves a lot of sacrifice and some pretty horrific happenings. King Gojien's army was very well known for their ability to scare their enemies before battle began, and this is because their frontline consisted of criminals who had been sentenced to death. In this time there wasn't lethal injection or the electric chair, so naturally it was a lot more of a vicious process. These criminals would decapitate themselves in front of the enemy army. Yep, I think this is probably the definition of a scary historical event. I can't even imagine witnessing something like that and then having to proceed with a battle against the army that has people doing that sort of thing. King Gojien was certainly not a leader who was wasting time messing around. In our number 2 spot today we have Topsy the elephant. Topsy was a female Asian elephant who was born in Southeast Asia around 1875. She was secretly brought into the United States shortly after and was unfortunately added to a circus who advertised her as the first elephant born in the US, despite that obviously not being true. During her 25 years with this circus, she gained a reputation as a bad elephant, and after she ended up killing a guest at the circus, she was sold to Coney Island's Sea Lion Park in 1902. The Sea Lion Park was eventually sold and renamed to Luna Park, and during Topsy's time here, she was involved in quite a few highly publicized incidents, which could be attributed to her drunken handler, the publicity-hungry owners of the circus, as well as the fact that this is all a perfect example example of why animals that belong in the wild should be in the wild. In the end, all of the horrible people who had a hand in Topsy being in this circus decided that since she was such a problem, they would execute her publicly. They were going to hang her, but because people thought that that was inhumane, they decided to take a different route. For the record, I just want to say that the execution of Topsy was inhumane no matter what method they chose, because Topsy didn't deserve to be in this kind of an environment. On January 4th of 1903, Topsy was fed carrots that were laced with potassium cyanide, and she was also electrocuted and strangled. To make this horrific day even worse, the event was both spectated and the Edison Manufacturing Movie Company was there to film the whole thing. Many people believe Thomas Edison was actually there himself, but that is something that is up for debate. This whole situation is absolutely heartbreaking, and Topsy deserved a lot better than everything she had to go through. In our number 1 spot today, we have the Red Summer. The Red Summer is something I didn't even hear mentioned in school, which is honestly absolutely shocking. I'm hoping this is something that is more commonly taught than I think it is, because it certainly is very important. The Red Summer is the term used to refer to the period from the late winter through to the early autumn of 1919, in which white supremacist terrorism and racial riots took place in more than 36 cities across America. Some of the more well-known race riots that took place during the Red Summer were the Chicago and Washington, D.C. riots, and the Red Summer also saw the Elaine massacre that took place in Elaine, Arkansas, which saw the deaths of between 100 to 240 black Americans. These anti-black riots are said to have developed from a multitude of post-World War I tensions, such as the economic slump and the competition in job and housing markets. In 1919, it certainly wasn't uncommon for there to be race riots and a multitude of white on black violence, but the Red Summer really marked some of the first race riots in which black people in number stood up to the white supremacy, resisted, and fought back. During the Red Summer, a civil rights activist named A. Philip Randolph publicly defended the right of black people to self-defense. It is said that between January 1st and September 14th of 1919, white mobs lynched at least 43 black Americans, but despite this, the states refused to interfere or prosecute these mobs. Considering how many race riots went on during this summer, we truly could dedicate an entire video to the Red Summer. It is insane to think about how recent 1919 really was, and while we certainly have come a long way, there is always more work to be done, and part of the work involves us learning about these horrible histories and what happened in our past.
Starting off at number 10, vampire killings. So starting us off, we have the supposed vampire killings from the 1800s. Now, spoiler alert here, they weren't actually vampires. Well, I guess I don't know that for sure, but I'm gonna go out on a limb and say they weren't. Anyways, back in the 1800s, people in New England believed that cadavers were rising from their graves at night and preying on the living. So to solve this problem, they began exhuming the cadavers. Now, some kept it simple and just turned the cadaver face down, but others jumped to more extreme methods like ripping the bones apart and rearranging them, or burning the deceased person's heart and inhaling the smoke. Apparently at the time, it was believed inhaling the smoke cured tuberculosis, though I can only imagine it made matters much worse for them. Some towns were so into the ritual that they would even hold festivals during the process and celebrate the exhumation and subsequent destruction of the corpses altogether. So while it was incredibly unsettling, they did truly believe they were vampires haunting them in the night, so I guess it gave them some peace of mind. Next up at number 9, dentures. While today dentures are made from composite resin or sometimes porcelain, during the 18th and 19th centuries, of course, those materials weren't available. But as you can imagine, people were still losing teeth at an even higher rate due to the high sugar diet, attempted teeth whitening, which was really just wearing away their enamel instead of brightening it, and the overall lack of knowledge around hygiene. So dentures were still needed and wanted by many. So what was their material of choice? Well, for the easiest and most profitable route, many would acquire the teeth from dead bodies. Although if you had some money, you might be able to afford dentures made from ivory. Other materials were sometimes the teeth of animals or wood, but honestly, I think we can all agree that none of those sound like terribly sanitary options, considering considering professional physicians at the time weren't sterilizing instruments, and some didn't even believe in disinfecting prior to surgery. Next up at number 8, stained glass. If you walk into just about any old church, you'll notice the walls are decorated with beautiful stained glass. But what might surprise you is that in some of the particularly older pieces, there is a strange ingredient that helps it all come together. In 1112, a German monk wrote about the process of creating the beautifully colored glass, and as he detailed, it starts off, innocently enough, adding sand and potash at a high temp until it becomes molten. From there, they'd add a stabilizer before coloring the glass with different metallic oxides like copper, cobalt, and gold. But once the glass was cooled and shaped, the small details were added by paint. They made the paint usually from lead or copper and would then suspend it in urine. So quite literally, some of those old stained glass windows were painted with pea paint, which I mean kind of just makes me giggle if I'm honest, but it is definitely a weird ingredient to think about being in paint. Coming in at number 7, leather-bound books. Nowadays, it's unusual to even find real leather on anything, but once upon a time, the leather on books wasn't even from cows. It was from people. Called anthropodermic bibliopegi, the books were made in a similar way as they would now, but obviously with one huge difference. They used human skin instead of an animal. While there are actually only 18 confirmed books of its kind that still exist, we have no idea just how many there could have been all those years ago. Allegedly, the books were usually made from executed convicts, and during the French Revolution, there were rumors that a tannery for human skin was established outside of Paris. I mean, it kind of gives me the willies to think about it, and I'm just glad we've moved on to a different material to bind our books today. Next up at number 6, Minnie Dean. Wilhelmina Dean, or Minnie as she was often referred to, was a nanny in New Zealand during 1880 and was a well-known caretaker in her town. But something was off with the woman, and soon she began having quite the dark spot on her name and career. In 1889, one of the young people under her care suddenly died, as if out of nowhere, and initially it was viewed as a freak accident, but 2 years later the same thing happened again. Now, with 2 minors perished under her care, police decided to investigate further into the matter. After a bit of sleuthing, it was concluded that under Minnie's care, the 2 minors were as she was attempting to take out life insurance on them. Police immediately took the remaining young boy in her care, finding it in dirty clothes and drinking curdled milk. By 1895, the investigation into her crimes continued, and she was spotted trying to flee on a train with another victim in her arms. And when police searched her house, they found 3 more covered up victims. Eventually found guilty for all her crimes, she was the first and only woman ever hanged in New Zealand. Next up at number 5, radiation test subject. In 1999, a man named Hisashi Uchi was a power plant technician, and he became known for being exposed to the highest amount of radiation of any human in history. While working at the Tokamura nuclear power plant, after a lack of safety protocols, improper training, and just an overall pressure to meet deadlines, Uchi and his coworkers made a terrible error. They mistakenly mixed an incorrect measurement of radioactive materials into the wrong tank, and as you've probably figured out, it caused a near fatal burst of gamma rays. Hisashi, who happened to be the closest to the incident, was brutally injured and sent to the hospital. Once he was there, it was discovered he had no more white blood cells, so essentially meaning that he had no remaining immune system. And despite being in intense pain with a rapidly deteriorating condition, doctors kept him alive under the family's request. So for 83 days, Uchi remained alive, being used as a test subject for experimental radiation treatment by the doctors, which, I mean, in their defense was the request of the family, but still, he endured several cardiac arrests, lost all of his skin, and suffered brain damage as well as organ failure. One of the last things Uchi ever said was, quote, "I can't take it anymore, I'm not a guinea pig." And then finally, one more cardiac arrest released him from his torture. Coming in at number 4, mumia. Most widely practiced between the 12th to the 17th century, although there were a few cases in the 18th century that pop up. Mumia was widely used as a means of medicine in many European countries. Now, if you can't tell by the name, mumia is creepily just as it sounds, the use of human remains to fix a living person's ailments. It was believed by many of the top physicians at the time that ingesting certain remains prompted the medicinal power of the mummy and could cure things like coagulated blood, pain, coughs, inflammation, cramps, and even heal open wounds. Now, they didn't just sit around eating the carcass directly. Instead, they would either grind the bones into a powder and drink it from there, or drink an extracted liquid from the embalmed individual. In fact, it was so popular at one point that it's believed the reason there are so few mummies these days is because of the high demand of flesh at the time. Coming in at number 3, James Jameson. One of the heirs to the Jameson whiskey family fortune, Jameson considered himself to be an adventurer of sorts and often traveled to far-off lands, detailing the trips in his diary. In 1888, Jameson decided to head out to explore the Congo, and while there he wrote about and demanded some gruesome things from the locals. So before beginning this expedition, Jameson discovered that the area he was visiting was known to have a population that participated in the eating of other humans. Apparently, Jameson set out to witness it firsthand, which, I mean, why was that his dream? A little suspicious if you ask me, but I digress. According to Asad Farhan, who was his translator for the trip, Jameson bought a girl from a trader of slaves for a few handkerchiefs and gave her over to the tribe to be. Allegedly, he didn't pay the tribe directly, but in a roundabout way, he did sort of pay to have this girl. What's even more gross is that he proceeded to draw and paint watercolors of the gruesome event while it happened, which again, just wrong on so many levels. Coming in at number 2, Cambodian Barbies. You may have been taught about the Khmer Rouge in history class, but if they don't ring a bell, essentially they were an extreme communist regime in Cambodia that held government between 1975 to 1979. They were known for being extremely cruel and committed some of the most horrifying acts of genocide in history, with nearly 2 million perishing under their ruling. Now, during their radical rule, the entire country was isolated from all foreign influences. This included closing schools, hospitals, factories, banks, foreign agriculture. They believed this would stimulate the rebirth of the country, but of course, all it did was send it into desolate famine and poverty. Led by a man named Pol Pot, the people of the country could not forage for food, despite the fact that everyone was starving, and anyone who disobeyed the orders was killed. Apparently, as the people became more and more desperate, they began to turn to folk magic, turning Barbie dolls into smoking talismans for luck. Thankfully, since its dissolution in 1999, all the leaders have been jailed for their atrocities, and the people are freed from the genocidal regime. And last up, in our number 1 spot, the Rabbit Woman. Her name was Mary Toft, and in 1726 she became known throughout Surrey, England as having been the woman who gave birth to rabbits. Now, I know what you're thinking, that isn't possible. And you would be right, but still the story of how she convinced people it was real was crazy. Apparently Toft was actually pregnant at one point, but miscarried, and it could have been this that sent her into her madness. Toft began declaring that she was giving birth to various animal parts, and so her local doctor became involved in the case. At first, everyone actually believed her, as in fact a rabbit did, well, come out of her. And with a doctor backing up her claims, the king and his royal surgeon got involved. Unlike her local doctor, the king's surgeon was skeptical, and after discovering corn inside the stomach of one of the rabbits and hay in their droppings, it proved the animal hadn't developed inside Mary. Eventually, Mary Toft admitted to the hoax and explained that she had manually inserted the animals inside her to make the delivery as realistic as possible. She was immediately imprisoned for fraud, and the medical community was ridiculed for having been fooled.